Welcome once again to the Altered Attitudes podcast, the podcast that delves into the realms of addiction recovery and the transformative journeys that lie within. We had the privilege of sitting down with Annmarie Ward, the fearless CEO of FavorUK, Faces and Voices of Recovery. With a blend of profound knowledge, academic expertise and lived experience, Annmarie takes us on a journey through the intricacies of addiction recovery and the ever-evolving landscape of support that's available. In this conversation, we delve into the various topics that promise to challenge your perspectives, from the mysterious shroud of anonymity in AA to the steps being made today to bring recovery to the forefront of Scottish policymaking. Throughout the episode, we unravel the unsettling truth about Scotland's problems with drug and alcohol abuse. Annmarie sheds light on the Right to Recovery Bill and emphasises the vital role of pioneers in the recovery space. We navigate the controversial topic of drug consumption rooms and the push for harm reduction. Anne-Marie's insights leave us questioning, challenging, and ultimately redefining our understanding of recovery. This episode is hosted by our very own Lester Morse with special guest Annmarie Ward. Let's get into it.
Guys, well, thanks very much for inviting me here this morning. I really appreciate the opportunity to talk on this podcast. So we were set up in 2009 with the three aims: to make recovery visible and to help people get access and choice of services. And we started doing that by organising and mobilising the recovery community across the UK through the UK Recovery Walks, which I'm sure some of your listeners will be familiar with. So we've been doing that. We just celebrated the 15th UK Recovery Walk in Hull this year, and we are now, looking forward to receiving bids from where the walk goes next year. But the whole intention behind the charity is to try and organise and mobilise the 5,500 members that we currently have into advocating in a very public and visible way for those who are still suffering to get access and choice of treatment, which, as we all know, is extremely limited here in the UK.
But Annmarie, just a quick question there. So you actually let towns and cities and that, they sort of ask, can you arrange the walk in their area?
Yeah, there's a bidding process, so committees, groups, individuals, services can put forward a bid. There's a bidding specification document and they can just put it forward for a bid. Usually there's 2 or 3 bids come in every year, so therefore it goes out to a public vote. That vote usually happens on social media. Sometimes there can be as many as 10,000 people taking part in the vote.
Oh.
The closing date for the bids this year is December the 20th, so I don't know if this podcast will go out before then, but if it does, get your bids in.
Yeah. What would a march consist of, just so people would know? Say you would like that in your town or city, what would actually happen then?
Well, it's a bit, the easiest way to describe it is it's a wee bit like gay pride without the fabulousness and the booze. So it's a real celebration of recovery, it's a celebration of people's journeys and their determination, their tenacity. It's also a celebratory event for family, friends and allies of recovery. So, the treatment services and the organisations that support us and help us sustain our recovery come along as well to support and celebrate the day. Basically, it's a great day out. There's usually a march, a procession through the town. There's usually a stage set up with entertainment. There's stuff for the kids, the usual sort of festival shenanigans like bouncy castles and ice cream and food, and just generally a really good old party. Yeah.
And people can then come along and sort of meet people that are in all sort of forms of recovery, abstinence-based recovery.
Yeah. So on the day we normally have people there from all the different pathways to recovery, and we also put on like a variety of different recovery meetings. So there's usually an AA, NA, CA, Al-Anon, Smart Recovery meeting. We make sure that there's a wee taster session for anybody who's curious to come along and listen in. So yeah, we try and represent all the different pathways to recovery. Yep.
How have you found the anonymous bit? Because I think people in recovery, they like to be anonymous. But I think they can go a little bit far. I think even Bill Wilson, when he come to England, said it was like trying to find the Secret Service. How do you, for the people that are in recovery that sort of think that's not being anonymous, what would you say about that?
Well, unfortunately, it's a fundamental misunderstanding of the tradition of anonymity. So we've produced a booklet on this called Advocacy with Anonymity and How Not to Break the Traditions but Still Make Recovery Visible.
Mm.
So there's a long tradition within Alcoholics Anonymous of visibility. Anonymity was never meant to mean invisibility, and I think the criticism is that if you're sort of putting yourself out there as a beacon of recovery, that you're at risk of a lack of humility first and foremost, but you're also at risk of bringing the fellowship in a disrepute. Well, one of the ways that we advise people to navigate that is to, when they talk about their recovery, not to mention, they can talk about the mutual aid fellowship. They can use that phrase, but they don't necessarily have to declare their membership of Alcoholics Anonymous, and of course, or Narcotics Anonymous, as the case might be, or any of the other anonymous fellowships. In that way they won't be breaking the tradition. But from my own personal point of view, I think having a visible representation of recovery to the general public really challenges stigma. I don't know how many times people have said to me over the years, "Oh, you don't look like an addict," and I'm like, "Oh, what does an addict look like?" So I think the very nature of offering that visibility just challenges stigma and stereotypes. We've still got a very long way to go with that. And I think that's
Annmarie,
one of the main reasons why people should consider it.
I think, because again, people watching the podcast have had a bit of trouble starting it this morning, but again, I think it really would be nice to sort of go back on your story and a bit on your journey, because I guess you've sort of gone on a journey of your own, and you've come to these conclusions because of your experience, and decided to create these marches and the build to recovery. But I think it really would be nice to get a bit of context to the background of where you're coming from, and what led you to realising there is a need, because it is quite radical, and again, I'm completely in agreement with you that people do need to see recovery, and this misconception of anonymity has been a bit of a barrier that does need to be sort of removed, because I think there's a lot of real miracles out there that are not really getting seen. So it'd be great if you could sort of tell us a bit about sort of your path and what led you to the realisation that this needs to kind of happen in our country.
Well, yeah, I think it's important to, say first and foremost that there's a false humility in keeping your light under a bushel. I was brought up with this sort of adage of sort of self-praise is no honour, which I very much believe in. But I think there's something about being visible and speaking about our recovery publicly when we assert the miraculous nature of some of our stories. And for me, the longer I stay in recovery, the more miracles I see on a daily basis, and the more I reflect, obviously, on my own journey, and that is just filled with, like, statistically I should be dead. My background is that I grew up in an alcoholic home. Both parents were alcoholic. My mother's alcoholism really progressed later in life, but we suffered badly. I've got three siblings, 2 brothers and a sister, and we all suffered in various ways. There was a lot of domestic violence, physical abuse. There was also sexual abuse. So when I found alcohol at aged 11, it was exactly the medicine I was looking for, and I continued to use alcohol and other drugs. I was using Class A drugs by the time I was 15, 16. but having always been brought up with a very, working class ethic, like you're fine as long as you go to your work, I was never, there was a real shame around, being on benefits or, you know, receiving any sort of charity as well. So very proud working class background. So right up until the age of 25, which was when I got clean and sober, I functioned to all extensive purposes. By the time I got clean, I had 3 jobs. But all of that was, ways and means to get more. That was the way my whole reason for working right from the age of 11 when I first found alcohol. I got my first job at 12 in a wee cafe, and it was for that purpose. It was so as I could get money for, at that time, alcohol and nicotine, and that just progressed until I was 25, and as I said, completely self-sufficient, um, and I eventually, I was using substances on a daily basis at that point while still functioning, still showing up for work, but people had become like pop-up characters in my life, who I had to have the bare minimum of interaction with in order to get away from them. Like there was no connection, there was no real connection in my life, although there was relationships that had been there my whole life. There was a barrier to connection in all those relationships, which of course that barrier was my addiction, but I couldn't identify that. And I got to the point where my spirit was at such a peep. I was in despair, and I cried it to a God that I didn't understand, I had no faith in, or I was very, very angry with. And I said, if you're there, help me. And I found myself within, I think it was within a few days, I'm not quite sure the time span, in my first meeting, my first mutual aid meeting, and I haven't used alcohol or other drugs since then. And I use that phrase very deliberately, alcohol and other drugs, because we seem to fall into this societal denial that alcohol isn't a drug, So, and since that day, since I went to that first meeting, the main thing that I was given was hope, and I also was given a program for living, because life without alcohol and other drugs was completely alien to me. I felt like a fish out of water, and alcohol and other drugs had been such a, you know, a help to, I firmly believe had I not found alcohol and other drugs, I may well be dead, because they were my first coping mechanism. I was very, as I said, I was suffering a lot of trauma, and to a certain extent, the alcohol and other drugs medicated that. And it wasn't until I found the Anonymous Fellowship that I'm still a member of today, and the people within that who had recovered from the trauma that I needed to recover from, that I felt able to step into that hope and attempt the journey of recovery.
Annmarie, what was the? 'Cause how long ago was that moment in your life?
Over 26 years ago now.
What did the anonymous fellowships look like at that time for you?
Well, I was living in London, so my very first meeting was in St Luke's Church in Chelsea. I lived in Wandsworth at the time, so I was really shocked at the members and who they were. It was Chelsea, and there was loads of young people. I was like, it was very attractive, and there was I wasn't giving anything up, because there was a whole new set of friends who were living clean and sober, who were still going dancing, who were still going clubbing, everything that a 25-year-old wants to do. So I had real access to that, but also had access to, my sponsor at the time was a cognitive behavioural and psychodynamic therapist. So she was also a sexual abuse survivor, so I had access to not just lived experience care, but professional care and professional guidance. So I was very, very lucky. I describe it as having access to the creme de la creme of, help that was available. And I couldn't have accessed that help in the community. There was at no point had I ever thought alcohol and drugs was the problem until I went to my first meeting. You know, it was through the course of going to meetings that I was able to identify, even though I'd been using on a daily basis, my denial was such that I genuinely thought alcohol and other drugs were the solution. So it wasn't until I started going to meetings regularly and attending meetings regularly that that denial started to break down, and I could see how dependent I had been for so, you know, for from such a young age, how obsessed I had been as well with finding ways and means to get more, and how that had totally dominated my life. So I was very lucky that fellowship was massively influenced as well, southwest London, by various treatment centres. So there was a lot of real therapeutic talk in the meetings, as well as, you know, my home group was Tooting Monday night, and it was a real bread and butter big book meeting. So I got really a big book study group. I just and one of my other home groups at the time was a 12 by 12 study group. So I got the, you know, looking back, I got the absolute best of what was available, and for me, I think that was very obviously God given and divinely gifted to me.
But I guess you get that as well, where it's like you obviously were very interested in it, and it was showing you plenty about yourself and life. Because I don't think people sort of understand that when you come into recovery, you just think, oh, I just want to stop getting into trouble, I just want all the problems to go away, and then as you start learning about all this spirituality and psychology and therapy and dysfunction, it's like this whole other world that you've been living in all your life starts emerging, and I found that could be a bit disturbing at the beginning, because you think, oh, when I sort myself out, the world's going to be all right. But then you start seeing there's actually quite a lot of problems in the
Yeah,
world and in the
well,
people
for
around you.
yeah, well, for me, it was really a process. You know, I had been, I remember my sponsor saying to me, "See that fake it till you make it? That doesn't apply to you. You've been faking it your whole life. You need to show up and get real." So, you know, I had been functioning to all extensive purposes. You wouldn't know that there was anything wrong because I was paying my taxes. I'm the only addict I know that paid her telly license. Um, but I was so focused on making everything look as if it was okay. Um, so I wasn't getting into, you know, a lot of the trouble. So when I first came, like I was like, I've never been to jail, I've never been to, you know, hospital, you know, like, so there was, it was, for me it was a real disconnection of, you know, I felt like an alien on the wrong planet. You know, it was that, and it wasn't until I landed in the rooms that I found that connection, that I found people speaking a language that I had no way to articulate, but it spoke the same language as my heart, you know, and you guys helped me articulate it. So yeah, I think there was a lot there that was, that could, you know, my life, to, from looking out from the inside, from the outside rather, I had everything a 25-year-old girl should have, you know. I had a nice house, I had money in the bank, I had clothes in the wardrobe, but it was the meaninglessness of it, it was the despair, it was the lack of point or lack of purpose that brought me to my knees, lack of connection. And the fellowship gave me that connection, you know, it plugged me in to the, in fact, my step 4 and 5 was really the like the Wi-Fi hotspot for plugging me in, because until I did my step 4 and 5, I had I had very little connection with the world in general. Although I was functioning in it and going through the motions of it, it was step 4 and 5 that brought me into my own humanity and helped me to see uh, the healing that needed to take place in order for me to recover.
And I guess you also realise the benefit that you could have in like helping other people and sharing some of that good quality information that you were getting with, because I know not everybody gets that. I was the same as you. I started my journey in Canada and I was in such a good group of people and I was there for 3 years. It gave me such a strong foundation. But when I come back to Watford, this was 30 years ago, that the difference in the quality of recovery and the quality of understanding dropped quite a lot. I felt a bit of an alien again, and found it difficult to understand how little they seem to understand about the program and the processes, just discovered it became a
That's
bit
really
difficult
funny.
for me then.
That's really funny. I had a similar experience at almost 3 years clean. I left London and came back to Glasgow and had an almost identical experience. There was very few women in the fellowship doing the steps. In fact, I think at one point I was like banging the table saying, "You guys have got to do the steps, otherwise I'm going to die," which is
Yeah,
technically true. And
yeah,
so yeah, I had a very similar experience, and it took me a wee while to get a sure footing again. And to pass on it. In fact, my sponsor now was a woman who came over from Canada. She's still my sponsor today. So she arrived in Glasgow I think about 9 months after I arrived, and I was like, thank you God, because she
yeah.
was coming from she had that experience, and she was just
Because
on
you
a
don't know
mission to
whether
take
it's
as many
you or
women
not.
through the
Because
steps.
I found that people, when I come back
No,
from Canada, is that they actually believed that doing the steps was going to this group on a Friday
yeah,
night where they read from the 12 and 12 and then they criticised it and
yeah,
they believed that was doing the steps. So when they actually started talking about the big book and actually following the processes written in the big book, then the attacks begin that you're a fanatic, you're a this, that and the other, and I found it quite shocking. And if it wasn't for them, same for you, if it wasn't for them guys in Canada and America encouraging you, it would have been difficult
yeah.
to just, because again it's a fellowship I was craving as well. It didn't really struggled in them other
Yeah,
groups.
yeah, yeah. Yeah, I think I mean, there's still this, this adage in the Glasgow Fellowship, in particular. I don't hear it really anywhere else in the world unless there's someone from Glasgow or from the west coast of Scotland in the meeting where they say, if you don't pick up the first drink, you can't get drunk, and which is the complete antithesis of the whole program. Because if I had the power not to pick up the first drink, of course I wouldn't get drunk. I wouldn't need to come to AA. So
Yeah,
there is still quite a lot of that old school um, unwellness. The remnants or the residue of that kind of thinking is still kicking around. I remember reading somewhere, and it was a long time ago I read this, and I don't know where I read it, but Bill Wilson came to Glasgow in the 50s, and he said, I don't know what it is, but it's no A. you know so that was like there was an acknowledgement that we had sort of bastardized it and not for the
reformed
better.
it.
um but it's been really interesting. I've saw AA in Scotland get a much needed revival through the Cocaine Anonymous Fellowship. So
From
there's been
Nicky,
Cocaine
is it
Anonymous is
Nicky, a young guy, Nicky, I forget his last name. I think he started the CA in Glasgow with his wife. I remember coming up there years and years ago.
well, yeah. Let's not say who started it, because my sponsor and another woman that I know, Remy, and various other people would claim that they started it. Let's not get into that
Remy,
debate. But
that's the
but
girl. Or that's the yeah. So I met
yeah,
them years ago in Glasgow in CA.
yeah. So I think that's really gave a real boost to the program,
Mm.
because there is, although CA is still a very young fellowship and immature in many ways, particularly around the service structure and just the ways that it functions, it has gave it a much needed boost to Alcoholics Anonymous as well. It's funny how it works, isn't
Yeah,
it? That we
yeah,
all the different fellowships serve each other if you can keep an open mind and see the links. So yeah, I see Cocaine Anonymous, and of course Scotland is the biggest users of cocaine in the world. Cocaine Anonymous has grown tremendously in Scotland, as it has in other parts of the UK as well. We've got a massive cocaine problem here, so I see a real benefit, and probably had Cocaine Anonymous been around when I first got clean, that would have naturally been the fellowship that I would have been most aligned with. But for me, I went to both Alcoholics Anonymous and Narcotics Anonymous, and still do, and occasionally pop into CA when I'm asked or a sponsee invites me along.
yeah. So what? So you were down in London 3 years, and you got back to Scotland and started to see that there was obviously some areas in the fellowship, because I think once you sort of get to sort of be go along in the fellowship a bit, then you sort of realise again, as I did in Watford, that there was a lot that could be improved. They weren't very happy with that, but it was the same thing. Is what I did was I got 10 guys and said, look, do you fancy just doing the steps as it's written in the big book? We do all the things that you're meant to do, just as like an experiment. We go to 90 meetings in 90 days. We get sponsors. We do voluntary. We just try and do everything that we believe that you're supposed to do, and just see what happens. And I got 10 of them to agree, and so they come round my house on a Wednesday and Sunday night, and we did our morning meditations and nighttime inventories and everything that we knew that you're meant to do. And it was amazing. It was amazing how many people noticed the difference in us.
Yeah.
In actually working this program.
Yeah, no, I mean, you that wasn't how I tackled it. I just sort of got my head down. I had one sponsee, and I got my head down in trying to build my own life. I was available for service, so I worked my way, or the fellowship worked its way through me, through the service structure. So I did like group rep, regional rep, area rep, UK rep, and served on the committee service structure. So I think that really schooled me for, the work that I do now, the charity work that I do now and setting up the charity. I learned a lot through, working in or being of service in the service structure. I learned how to do business, and I don't mean that in a money making sense. I mean it in a sort of structural and communication sense. So yeah, I didn't. I sort of, my sponsor was focused on doing that. She was taking quite a lot of women through the program at that time. But I probably spent the next 10 years of my life trying to build a life for myself that was that I didn't that I didn't want to let go of. So I went to university. I fell pregnant unexpectedly in my first year at university. So it took me until I was about 5 years clean. That's when I went to university. It took me that long to feel assured that I was on solid ground. Up until that point, I was always like, this could go tits up any moment. And that was probably because I had a lot of trauma to recover from. And at 5 years clean, I went to uni and, as I said, fell pregnant with my son. He's 21 now. So I really, in the early years, I was focused on him and trying to build a life for me and him. I was a single mum most of that time. So it wasn't until he was about 9 or 10 that I set up the charity. I started doing the walks in 2009, so he would have been 8 then, 8 or 9. And the decision to come to that was...
Sorry, you was just going to answer it yourself then. I was just going to say what sort of led you to that decision, and what was you trying to address by doing that? What had you discovered?
Well, there was a couple of things. I mean, there was a forum at the time called Wired In, and there was a lot of people who were interested in the lack of access and choice of services in the UK who came together on that platform. And I called a meeting basically in Glasgow, and people came from all over the UK to see if we could emulate what was being done in the States, because there was already an organisation called Faces and Voices of Recovery in the States, and I wanted to set up something similar. Our first few attempts, we set up as a charity, a community interest group. Then we became a community interest company. And that, it was a few years later before we became a charity. I had always wanted us to be a charity from the beginning, but the real reason was because there was so little access and choice of services. I realised how lucky I had been to stumble into the fellowships and to avoid the treatment system. Personally, I had felt like if I had went into the treatment system, I might not have got out of it. So
could you expand on that a little bit more, Annmarie, for people that might not know, especially I guess in Scotland, that there was treatment being provided. Could you expand on the difference, or what your what the reasons for that?
Yeah.
Why you come to them conclusions?
Well, there's this understanding that when the general public thinks about treatment, and up until that point, when I thought about treatment, I thought about rehab. I thought that's what treatment was. But actually, the longer I stayed in recovery and the more people I meet who were, coming out of treatment and coming into the rooms, I quickly realised that for the most part, what treatment actually meant was a substitute prescription. And of course, that has some value initially. But it fundamentally misunderstands our condition. If you're substituting one drug for another, there's a lack of understanding that my condition will get used to whatever that substitution is, and it will still want more. Essentially, I suffer from a disease of more. Regardless of what it is I'm trying to fix myself with, whether that be, a sedative or a barbiturate or a narcotic, whatever it is, it's something that I'm trying to fix something inside with. It might be gambling, shopping. My understanding, especially being a member of Narcotics Anonymous, was that I was powerless over addiction. It wasn't a particular substance or a particular behaviour that I was powerless over. It was addiction overall. And that made perfect sense to me, because certainly in those early years of recovery, I found myself being obsessive and compulsive about other things. So I quickly learned that it wasn't actually about the substance. So our treatment system treats the symptom rather than the condition. And it treats the symptom with another symptom, which is fundamentally, it can initially be, there can be some relief from that, and there is obviously a crime reduction dividend to the public purse around that, which is the main reason why we still insist on that mode of treatment. Although I would argue, if any researchers were to look at that now, that that drug crime reduction dividend is certainly highly questionable now that we've kept people on the methadone program for over 30 years. The public purse, what that has cost the public purse, when I talk about this, I'm accused of stigmatising methadone users, and it's not a criticism of people who are still using methadone after 30 years. It's a criticism of the unethical nature of the system that has allowed that. The research tells us that there are a tiny minority of people who will need, who have a sort of opiate impairment, like their brain will no longer recognise natural feelings of elation because of opiate addiction. But that represents like a tiny minority of people who are addicted to opiates. So I think there's real ethical questions around, the nature of, that initial totalitarian public policy, which was about, you think about drug addiction in the 80s, high unemployment, all our poorest communities, Glasgow, Liverpool, Manchester, the schemes, basically, the housing estates, where loads of young men were unemployed. Heroin was a full-time job. You're trying to get a bag of heroin every day, you're busy. You know what I mean? You're really busy. So the crime reduction dividend that was initially put forth as the argument for the methadone programme by Thatcher's government,
which I guess would be able to sell that to the general population, because I guess when you think of drug addiction and crime, that they're going to want to bring the crime down, so everybody's going to agree that's a good policy.
Yeah, of course, but it was a short-term policy, because as any addict knows, that became, methadone was breakfast. It cut crime in the morning, or like they need to score in the morning, but still, because this is a progressive condition where we need more, there was still, the crime was still happening, people, and this again isn't stigmatising people who use methadone or stigmatising people who are addicts. This is the nature of the beast that we suffer from. Like, it will drive us to crime, and anybody who's sort of claiming that we are being stigmatised, and by talking about that honestly is being deliberately disingenuous, and that's me being polite, because
Yeah, well, I think the statistics
every addict
in
on the planet will talk about this. Yeah.
I think still the statistics in England that have recently got is 50% of robberies addiction based, 50% of burglaries, 50% of homicides, 80%
Yeah.
of
So
people in
there's
jail. So it's not a. It makes you wonder why they don't stigmatise it more, and they don't realise actually the massive cost that addiction does actually cause to society.
yeah, well, there's an element. I was recently criticised for this as well. There's an element of sort of positive shame that comes with stigmatisation. Like there was parts of my behaviour when I was using that I was ashamed of, and when I stopped using, I stopped behaving like that. And I then had to heal from that shame, and I, that's why, the fact that I sort of knew that I was, that when I was no longer addicted, I was no longer powerless. But if I'm still addicted, whether that drug's legal or illegal, comes from a chemist or a
Yeah.
pharmacy,
Well,
whatever.
addiction doesn't know the difference.
Yeah, absolutely. So there was elements of my behaviour that were shameful when I was using that,
Mm.
but I can see that I have, um, there was a powerlessness to what drove those behaviours. And the minute I was free from the dependency and the need to use, those behaviours stopped. And I think that's the case for most, people once they get into recovery, obviously I'm generalising here, but I think after 26 years of going to meetings, like, I've got a good grasp of what's going on with people in recovery, and I think it's fair to say that, most of us don't indulge in behaviour that uh, brings shame.
Yeah, I mean,
And I
even
think I think there's
the
a
stigma
positive
thing.
case. Yeah.
Sorry. I think even the stigma
No,
thing,
go
and
ahead.
like,
Sorry.
I like to think that because again, sort of coming, and again, I've been on the front line of addiction again myself for 33 years. It's been my whole life, and in a mass experience with quite a few thousand people, and seen quite a lot of variations of what can go on for people. But even sort of trying to destigmatise, it's like when they stigmatise drink driving, for example, it really brought the figures down to try and take all of the, again, I see the harm minimalisation, and it's good that it brings down HIV and hepatitis, and again, like you say, it's questionable whether it brought crime down. I mean, Change Grow Live used to be called Crime Reduction Initiative, which I thought was a terrible name to call something for people to go to. But it, and again, it may bring that down. Questionable about the crime, but it doesn't treat the addiction.
Yeah.
And I think that's
Yeah.
kind of what I was hearing you saying. It's like to call it treatment. It's not really treatment. It's improvement in some
Yeah.
areas, but it's not. It's not treatment.
Yeah, and I don't know if it's improvement to the individual. It might be improvement to the public purse, but I don't think
Yeah.
it's improvement to the individual. And I
No.
think it's important that we recognise that, our policies are a bit blanket, they're a bit blanket policies for the general public. They're not about the individual and that individual's recovery and the healing that people, nobody chooses to become an addict or an alcoholic. The the level of work that is required to enter into the process of recovery and to stay into the process of recovery, you know, many people balk at that, and a lot of people don't, sustain that journey because it's so hard. So I think there's a recognition that hasn't fully sunk in yet. Like there's a lack of ambition within our so-called treatment services that we can actually get well, but I think there's a lack of recognition about what that entails. The tenacity, perseverance, and the principles that of personal growth that are required in order to sustain that. We don't recognise that in our treatment system, and I don't think we can. It's too big, I think. Yeah, but if we did, if we had a very recovery orientated treatment system, rather than a treatment system that is trying to focus on, like, crime reduction dividends, I think we would,
Well, I've
if we
seen,
recognise the whole person.
like yourself, I've kind of been up the mountain and I've seen the promised land, running a rehab and being right sort of at the centre of quite large recovering communities where there's hell of a lot more support focused on, and everyone around could see it as well. Just like the example I had in Watford, that all of the authorities and everybody around could see, in their words, that we were head and shoulders above everything else that they were seeing. The quality of the people emerging because they were being empowered. They were getting their own jobs, getting their own education, getting their own housing, supporting each other. So I've seen that actually in reality, but at the same time, I could also see how little support or acknowledgement of how important that core that we put together was, and it's really not at the top. In actual fact, the authorities attacked that and made it impossible for some strange reason.
And then you'll be accused of being paranoid or prejudice,
which
or
I am.
some other. Yeah, but I think I think this is another thing. Like, when we talk about being powerless, over our addiction, like, the sort of people outside the recovery community would see that as being a disempowering statement, when actually it's the complete opposite. It's one of those paradoxes, the many paradoxes that we experience in recovery. Is the minute we can see that powerlessness, we become powerful and we become empowered to build, to take responsibility for our lives. I remember my story is pretty horrific, my childhood story in particular. And I remember saying to me, it's a really good victim story. You could die in it, and that no one would blame you if you used again. No one would, you'd totally get a pass if you burnt your life to ground here, because what you've experienced is horrendous. But what are you going to be? You're going to be a victim. You're going to be a survivor. And it was like a punch in the gut, because I didn't want that responsibility for my life. I really didn't at that point. I was like, I was so used to, blaming other people for me, that being handed that responsibility was initially terrifying, and it's something that obviously I cherish now, and I take, I've got an over sensitive, I suppose, sense of responsibility now. I feel very duty bound.
Sorry, Annmarie, I just wanted to say as well, because again, I totally identify with that. Because again, I think having addiction is one thing, but then having like a difficult, sort of very dysfunctional childhood is almost a compounding problem. But I think, like, listening to your story, is that would be very difficult to try and hand that level of responsibility to an individual. That obviously, because again, it says we were powerless, not we are, but the evidence is the unmanageability of the life. I never really felt powerless once I understood what it was actually saying to me, but I also realised I wasn't alone from that point with the responsibility, because I didn't know how to interact with the world, and I didn't know how to cope with a lot of the issues that life was throwing at me. But from that, this is why I love the fellowship so much, because there's a lot of people there that could support me and help me to take on that responsibility if I was willing, which allowed me to then start developing the capacity to be able to live a life free from substance.
Yeah. And I know for me as well, it was having that safety net, like, and I never really believed it. And there's been times where, where I've attended meetings and, especially in recent years, I've had quite a bit of trauma from relationships. So there's been times where, initially the attitude that I had when I was first coming to meetings, which was, well, you guys have said you are going to help me, so let's see if you are actually going to help me, so I sort of had that kind of belligerent, well, you said you are going to show up, are you going to show up, and there's been a few times where that's happened, and certainly in recent years, and it never fails to let me down, and sometimes it might be something as simple as a newcomer, like a newcomer sharing something about their experience that reminds me not only how far I've came, but what I need to practice, like it's always there. Like, in early recovery, you see coincidences everywhere, and everything's like, brighter the grass is greener, the sky is bluer, and that I've found a sort of channel within, being part of the anonymous fellowships that I can tap into that sky is bluer, the grass is greener. There's a I don't know, a sort of golden thread that runs through our fellowship that helps us realign always with not just a sort of positive mental attitude, but a real deeper purpose and meaning. And I don't think that constant reminder of purpose and meaning to our lives, it probably happens in faith-based communities, people who are very active in the church or active in, maybe even people that are very active in political movements have the same meaning, purpose, or a similar, sense of meaning and purpose. But I think there's something very special about what we have that isn't aligned, or it's not part of a dogma or an ideology. I think there's a power that we can access that is very unique, and if people are really interested in it and exploring it, from a sort of intellectual point of view, it's quite anarchistic what we do. In the true sense of the word, there is divine order in it, but there's no bosses, there's no hierarchy. So it's always been attractive to me as an organisation as well. Just how it functions. It functions like an inverted triangle. It functions the opposite way. Like everything that we hold high in a hierarchical society, it functions in the opposite way, and it continues to grow.
Yeah, yeah, it amazes me when you actually, when I think I understand it a bit better after 33 years, but it's a miracle. I think it's a miracle that anyone recovers, really. Because
Yeah,
it's so complex,
I
because
know.
it is like the human brain. And I think one of the wishes that I really wish for society, and again part of the reason why we sort of do podcasts and everything else that we try and do, is that I just wish that people would understand the damage that's done to the brain of somebody taking mind altering substance over a long period, when they are attempting to stop, even though I guess it seems to be an impossible task. But that, I love that bridge. It says the bridge to normal living, and so I think that to understand what that bridge is and how difficult it is for a brain to recover, but it will recover, and the stronger the environment we can put it in, the recovery environment, then the more chance that that person's got of spending the years that it takes. And I think initially you've got to be looking at a good 4 years to get over to that bridge, to ever, to the peaks and troughs start slowing down a little bit, and because there's a very real practical physical thing going on in that brain, that the neural pathways are literally needing to rewire, but they can and they do, given the right environment. I think, like you quite rightly said, that there's certain drugs that people are being given as a treatment that they're just never, that's never going to happen. There's never going to be
Yeah,
a opportunity for their brain to redevelop the ability to, because nature's just waiting to kick back in again to
yeah.
say let.
I heard that I heard it described, and it was in a YouTube video years ago. Again, I can't remember who it was, but it was they took brain slides of people in abstinent recovery. You know, the
Mm.
neurologists like sliced the brains of people in long term abstinent 12 step recovery, and they compared that with the brains of people who had recovered, who had abstained, but who hadn't attended 12 step fellowships. And what they described was when you're in addiction, the neurological pathways get caught in a loop, and the pathway gets, the groove within the pathway gets deeper and deeper, and you just get stuck on the same loop over and over again. And what they found in the difference with these brain slides was the people who had attended 12-step meetings, they had developed new neural pathways, and the groove, the depth of the groove had got filled in essentially,
Yeah,
and they had
sockeye,
created all these
they
new
call that.
synapses and new. But people who had just abstained hadn't created those new paths, and
No.
the grooves had stayed as deep within the
Yeah,
neural paths.
that's what recovery is. It's that essential ingredient, which again we don't see in a lot of them other services, that allows that redevelopment to take place because it creates
Yeah.
a very strong environment. There's a great video, if anyone's interested. It's called Pleasure Unwoven, and I think you alluded to it. That there's a pleasure deafness that occurs in the brain with a hedonic set point changes, but it actually talks through it's about the choice argument. It's by Dr. Kevin McCauley. It's called Pleasure Unwoven. It really is a good video to watch because it does explain the process of what actually goes on in the brain. Again, it's from America, from the Alcohol Institute.
Yeah, and that also gives weight to the powerless argument once you're, you know, when you're in, when that groove, when that groove is so deep, it gets stuck in that loop, and it takes, you know, it takes a whole new way of life. And I think even, I remember my early days, you know, living in London. I'd been living in London for 9 years, and I knew London by the pubs. So I could tell you which, like Kilburn, this pub, that pub, that pub. So when I started going to meetings across London, you know, I got to know the city. I got to know, you know, the different ways to travel, the different, you know, my life really opened up, even just from a really basic geographical point of view. It really opened up. You know, I wasn't stuck going to the same places all the time. So that in itself, you know, built you know, by the time I was 5 years clean, I was ready to go to uni, you know. And also, I think for me, having had a traumatic background as well, I was never, you know, I was always on a state of high alert at school. So I was never, you know, regulated enough to study or to concentrate in any real way. And recovery gave me that. It regulated my whole system, you know. It took, like I said, it took 5 years, 4 or 5
But
years
that's
to
one of the
get to that point where
professional
I thought,
definitions that we use of somebody with addiction, that they're an adult who's either never had or lost the ability to adjust and control their emotional states because that's
yeah.
been created by their thought processes being out of control. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, critics of recovery, particularly critics of 12-step recovery, really have no idea what's going on
no, and I don't know
in
why,
our
because there's so much
community. You know, they really,
evidence. There's so much evidence
yeah,
now. And again, it's like even in my own experience is actually building quite a miniature little city within a city that was thriving and showing and doing talks on brain at the same time of showing people that this is why it's working. And but if you don't understand our version of recovery, that is, I think you said it simply, which was I never quite heard it like that. That the people that may become abstinent but don't do any development, their brains really obviously are going to stay as they were. You pretty much got an addict that doesn't take drugs anymore. But when
yeah,
the people engage in recovery, which again is the program, that's why it says we were, not we are powerless, that the brain starts to redevelop, which, you know, and again, under brain scan, like you say, you can see the more light developing in the frontal lobes of the people. And the more light you've got, the more life you've got in your body, then of course, the more happy you're going to be because the trouble with addiction is whether you actually are dead or not, it takes you very close to it on a daily, momentary basis. Why would you be happy when you're that close to death all the time?
Yeah. And you know, for me, like, of course there are other paths that other people get well on, do you know what I
Mm.
mean? But for me, you know, I'm so glad that that my journey took me on this path, and I've had, you know, I've obviously, you know, my first sponsor being a CBT therapist, and I've tapped into therapy over the years as well for various things. Um, I'm just so glad that the what I tapped into, that program that we are offered, we're invited to partake in. It's not like a requirement. You know, there's no requirement. The only requirement is a desire to not use. We don't even, you know, demand abstinence from people, you know. But the invite to take part in that program, which is completely limitless, you know, as far as growth's concerned, has been the gift of my life. There's no doubt about it. It's deeply influenced my son and how I brought him up. The open-mindedness, the willingness to continue to grow, that is, you know, uh, you know, as that we practice is something that, again, you know, even if you're part of a political movement or a religious movement, I don't think that open-mindedness and that willingness to grow along spiritual lines is available in the way, the simplicity of how it's delivered as well, is something that I don't see access, and I've explored lots of those areas, you know. I've looked into the doctrine of various religious faiths and the ideology of different political movements, and I just don't see the freedom and liberation and the development opportunities that we're given in those other um, movements. So I'm so grateful that I'm personally allowed, you know, graced to still explore that. I mean, it's incredible, the journey that I've been on, and I'm sure you have been too. Not intellectually, emotionally, spiritually. You know, we get to hit all the good points in life and really mark them with, you know, have
Yeah.
discernment around what's happening, you know, and not take any of it for granted.
Yeah. Well, I think I'm quite clear at the age of 57 and 33 years that I couldn't do this on my own, and this having the foundation of my life as my program, I think that's made it possible and still is today. Because again, you know, when the drinking and drugs went down, the problems didn't go away. The emotional and mental
Yeah,
torture, trauma carried on,
yeah,
and still is in some areas of my life. But you know, I can
yeah,
still be overcome it and be successful. But I still use, you know, my program development, and you know, like I say, I think AA or the 12-step fellowship is sort of a dispenser of universal principles. But you know, I've worked with a
yeah,
lot of professionals over the years and different beliefs and therapies, but I still haven't come across anything that's simpler. But I can understand a lot of people may have prejudices and be offended by it because what it's dispensed by and what is packaged in, if they can just get past that bit, I think they'd find a wonderful program that you need really
yeah.
not
And I
have
suppose,
any issue with.
yeah, and I suppose, yeah. Sorry, go ahead.
That's it, I'm finished, thank you. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry, yeah. And I think that that's, I mean, the discussion that we've just had about, you know, the nature of 12-step recovery sort of brings me to why we, you know, brought the Right to Recovery bill to the Parliament. And it was primarily because of what we spoke about there regards to treatment, that we could see people were coming forward and asking, we were hearing from them all the time, people were asking for treatment to help them get free from their dependency on the substance. And people couldn't access that. We couldn't help them access it either. Um, they were coming to us saying that they didn't want to engage in the traditional treatment structures because there was nothing there for them. Um, they were coming to us and saying, like, I really want to go to rehab, but my drug worker or my doctor is saying that I'm not ready. I've been on a methadone script for 20 years, or other people come to us and say, I want to come off my methadone and I want to go into Buvidal, but they'll not let me. So we were saying people being, they just never had choice and access, and we had tried via the charity for many years to highlight that, one of the things I remember saying earlier, and there was huge complaints about this, was I was presenting at a conference in Bournemouth the year we started, and I said, look, it doesn't matter what your professional training tells you is. So it was a room full of social workers and doctors and nurses. I says, some of your professional training will tell you this is a brain disease. Some of your professional training will tell you it's a behavioural condition. It's a learned behaviour. I said, none of that matters. What matters is you give people access to all the paths that might help them get well, because none of us can predict which path will work. So your job is to make sure that you give people access to all the different paths that may or could help them get well, and not to punish them if one path doesn't work, to still give them access to the other paths and that path again, because again the research tells us people will try somewhere between 5 and 8 times before they really get on their journey to recovery.
Yeah, because that brain development while they're still actively in addiction, it's an arduous journey, but it still can move you forward, but it has to be in an environment that allows that to happen. While we say keep coming back, it does allow the brain to start developing.
But it was that professional prejudice, like, of people saying, no, this is the path that works, no, this is the path that works, no, this is the path that works. And we were like, no, there are many paths to recovery and all are a cause for celebration. And at that time particularly, the 12 steps and can still be massively prejudiced against. People have a terrible misunderstanding of what it's about. Just the mention of the God word has some people sizzling, spitting with fever. So, that was why that was our original strap line. Like, we are making recovery visible, and there are many pathways, and all are a cause for celebration, not just the ones that your professional training tells you are the good ones. You have to, your job as a professional is to make sure people get access and choice of them all, and that's essentially what the Right to Recovery Bill does. It would make it the law.
Sorry, what would be your view, the reason for that, if you've that it's actually formed in the way that it has, the treatment services? Is it sort of financial reasons or philosophy or professional? What would you think the reason it's actually formed in that way? And again, I think the 12-step problem, I think we all face that in professional circles.
Yeah. Do you know what, Lester? I don't even think it matters what I think about that. I do think there's been financial implications and financial motives, and obviously big pharma. It's obvious. You don't need me to pontificate about why that's the case. The important part is, as far as I'm concerned, is that the addiction sector has an opportunity now to move people's right to access and choice of the many paths into the law, out of because we're very much at the political whim of whatever party's in place, whether or not the addiction treatment sector gets funded and which programs get funded more than others. But if you take it out of the hands of the politicians and put it into the hands of the law and make it the law that you can get access to treatment, well, that's a different ballgame altogether. And not only that, it means that no one can ever take that funding away again, as they have done many times over the course of the last 30 years. Funding has been taken away, given back, taken away, given back. And this would essentially ring fence people's access and the public money in order for people to access treatment that they need. And through that, it would be everything from, methadone and all the various harm reduction interventions. And this is the difference. When we talk about treatment as people in recovery, we're talking about treatment that helps people get freedom from their dependency, and that's what the general public thinks we're talking about when we talk about treatment, whereas
No,
actually the industry is talking about harm reduction interventions and
they've
substitute
changed the
prescriptions.
words.
So yeah, so the
But
meaning of
they've
words, I mean,
also
they're trying to
changed. Sorry.
redefine rehab. They're
Well,
also
they are
trying to
now.
redefine the word
They
rehab in
have
Scotland.
treatment,
Yeah,
recovery.
yeah,
But again, I think the
yeah,
reason I ask that question is because, you know, the friends that I have that work in them industries, they often say, well, rehab's too expensive. And again, it is always my belief that with the lack of better treatments, that chemicals are going to be offered because they're going to challenge doctors just in a in a lesser version of methadone and other opiate replacements. That when you're in a rehab, and I used to say to the people coming in over quite a lot of years, so I asked quite a few hundred people, I would say, look, who went to the doctors at the worst time in their life? Everybody puts their hand up. Who got prescribed high-powered sedatives, which all have on the packets, do not drink alcohol? Everybody puts their hand up. Who got better? Nobody puts their hand up, never have. Who got worse? Everybody puts their hand up. And even like that, in 1937 in the AA Big Book, it says I was prescribed high-powered sedatives, and then the trips to the asylums began. So, you know, that they, and even when I've challenged doctors over the years and said, look, why are you giving these chemicals to these people that you're actually making worse? Do you not realise that? And I think you're contributing massively to overdose in the very nature of the name, overdose, which I think they're just starting to collect more toxicology reports to show that people that are overdosing and suicide, and to see what chemicals they've got in their system, it's shocking. And doctors always say, well, we've only got 5 minutes, and it's like, that's not a good reason to give people these high-powered sedatives that are actually making them worse because you haven't got a better treatment. And so I think that there is that is that part that they say that, well, we can't afford it. But so again, looking at the statistics, it's like you can't not afford it really when you work out the cost. And I don't know whether you've come across this, but I've been noticing on the government reports that they always say, I don't think it's UK, I'm not sure whether it's just England, but it says that the cost of alcohol to the country is 21 billion, but that statistic was put together in 2007. There's a group called the IIS, the Institute of Alcohol, and their studies show that it's more like 51 billion. Now again, in the Dame Carol Black's report, she says every pound they give recovery or treatment, which is unfortunately going to all of your turning points and them kind of people, that there's a £4 return to society in NHS and criminal systems and other areas. So by not investing in that form of treatment, you're actually spending more money.
yeah. It's always been a short-term fix. That's the problem. You know, it was right back to Thatcher. The crime reduction dividend was a short-term fix. It was, and that's why the right to recovery bill is so important, because it would take it out of the hands of politicians. The politicians are only interested in 3-year terms. We're interested in helping people get well. That takes time, and it takes investment up front. All the guys and girls that I got clean with, I mean, I was quite rare that I got clean in the rooms, you know. Most of them came through some sort of rehab, and I'm talking about people who were then in their 20s, who were ages with me. Those people have all been contributing productive members of society for the last 25, 30 years. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
They've paid their taxes, you know. And what I've seen over the years is, you know, that decline in people getting access to rehab, and people getting, you know, not getting the chance, not getting the choice, not getting the opportunity to get freedom from that dependency. And actually, it's became so bent out of shape in Scotland that our Drug Death Task Force, in their final report, you know, they were put together in 2019 as a response to the pressure that we put on the Scottish Government, where You Keep Talking, We Keep Dying campaign. They got a range of experts together, addiction experts, led by a pharmacist. And there, at the end of their report, their 3-year term, there was a 12% rise in drug deaths. And they actually stated in their final report, which had, I can't remember, there was 700 times it mentioned the word should in it. And we all know as people in recovery what that means, shoulda, woulda, coulda. But they also spoke about how abstinence-based recovery was stigmatising, and we shouldn't ask people to do that because it's stigmatising to ask people who are addicted. I think that's utterly absurd. That we should be so far out of shape, bent out of shape, that a pharmacist-led task force is advocating that abstinence-based recovery is stigmatising. That is so very obviously insane. And also,
it's like you're being cruel offering that as an option.
Yeah, we are. We're stigmatising drug users by suggesting that they might want to stop using drugs. That's not kind. It's not compassionate, Lester.
Because they're going to fail, and then you're going to make them feel bad, apparently.
And what we should just be doing, and this is the Scottish Drugs Forum, who are the largest government quango in the UK, based in Scotland. They are now promoting what they call so-called safe supply. So what we should just be doing is giving people heroin and cocaine, and we should be doing that in a measured and regulated way.
Oh, I thought that was going to come after the great success of the consumption room, the safe supply.
That's the trajectory that they're laying out. And just this week, we were always supportive of drug consumption rooms. We were always critical in that we were saying that, it's a sticking plaster, and it's palliative care. It does nothing to help people access treatment. So we were supportive in the sense that we were saying, well, it's one of the things that you could do, but the Scottish Government used it as a massive political weapon against Westminster, blaming Westminster for our drug deaths because we never had, drug consumption rooms, which, certain sections of the Scottish public bought into, but it was political posturing because England doesn't have drug consumption rooms and we've got 3.5 times less deaths in England, But
would that be I guess sort of my perception of looking at Scotland and again listening to some of the things that you've written and done before would sort of make me think that the consumption rooms are without question a desperate measure in a desperate situation, but then you got our question, well, what led it to that place?
I think what led it to that place, pure and simple ideology, right? Because just this week, and I've not been able to articulate this in writing yet, but I will over the course of the next week or so, I've came across loads of evidence that has highlighted that drug consumption rooms are of no value, public value at all. In fact, the deaths are higher, the overdoses are higher. There was a meta-analysis done on all the research on drug consumption rooms that one of the authors got death threats from publishing, which I find incredible, so that hints and points to the money that's involved here.
It seems like a lot of money as well, the funding, like 7 million, I think, for 3 years. That seems like a lot of money, doesn't it?
Well, when you compare it to, so in Glasgow, if you use Glasgow as a microcosm, you have a £50 million treatment budget here.
Oh.
They're already spending 4 million a year on heroin assisted treatment. 2.3 million now in a drug consumption room. They're claiming that 1.5 million has been spent on rehab, and the rest of it has obviously been spent on substitute prescriptions or system management. But to have a system that only spends 1.5 million out of 50 million on actual rehab is utterly insane. It's devoid of any sort of ethics.
But rehab, it's also, and again in England it's the same now, if they do get funded to rehab, it's only going to be pretty much a detox, probably for 4 to 6 weeks, not the sort of 6 months to 9 months that I think most of
people
the
need.
people
All
that
the
really
evidence.
need that with.
They're always talking about evidence-based treatment. All the evidence base says the longer that you're in rehab, the better, and yet they're shortening the.
Well, they don't research that. That's I was talking to Luke Trainer from Birmingham University, who set up the recovery support in the university, which is quite fantastic. But he was we was talking about how little research there is into what goes on in the 12-step and people in that recovery. But hopefully they're going to start evidencing some of that as well, because I think it's so important for people to see, say, look, this really doesn't make sense what they're doing. It just doesn't make sense.
Recovery research overall is really limited, but what we do know is that it works, and that people get access to it. It really works. They get to build and lead extraordinary lives in a lot of cases, So I think this worrying pattern that we're seeing now in Scotland is that they're redefining the word rehab. So, as I said, Glasgow City Council's claiming it spends 1.5 million, or in fact, that's a lie. They're claiming they're spending 5 million on rehab. Now, there's only 23 rehab places. Some of those places cost £1,000 a month. Some of them cost £800 a month. So, at the most, that comes to 1.5 million. But in their audits back to the government, they say they're spending 5 million. And it's just, when they talk about rehab, they're now redefining what rehab is. So they're talking about stabilisation centres. They're talking about mental health beds. When you dig into what they're actually claiming as rehab, I went and spoke to an organisation recently in Scotland who were being wheeled out by the government as a rehab. And when I went and talked to the women who run that service, and it was like being met by a set of guards, actually, because they know that I'm all over this. They don't want me questioning what they're doing. I soon discovered, after a few minutes chat with them, that it wasn't rehab that they were doing at all. There was some palliative care going on, and no doubt there was some compassionate work happening, where they were trying to, help women who had children not get their children taken from them. But it wasn't rehab, Lester. Do you know what I mean? Like, not in any sense that we understand
they've called
it.
one in a city near me. They've called it a rehab, but really it's just a drop-in centre.
Yeah.
But they've changed the name of treatment. They've changed the name of recovery. Now they're changing the name rehab to be a lot lesser than what we would expect it to be.
It's Orwellian, isn't it? It's
strange. Again, I try and resist the conspiracy theories, but when you kind of made this your life and looking from, I guess, our point of view, and we share the sort of similar conclusions of the reality, not the statistics, because when I look at their statistics, it all looks really good, but but the reality is, what I see is, in the last 20 years, because I've been there from the beginning, that since the harm minimalisation and the methadone and more drugs have been made available to drug addicts, the death rate's been rising. When we've got a treatable, even when I try, reading all of their reports and trying to understand them, because they're not easy to understand if you're not working in their industry constantly, even in a private sector, which I was. All their acronyms and words they use, it's like, I'm not sure what you're even talking about, but they even say things, that most of the deaths are of people that are not in treatment or not access treatment. But then when which they get from their MTDMS, I think it's called, but then they put their report together based on that. But then you look at the national statistics of drug poisonings, it actually appears that you've got probably 3 times more chance of dying in treatment than in their version of treatment than not. And again, it's so hard to actually verify these facts, because unless they're willing to accept them, which they're definitely not, there's no way of saying, look, I'm not 100% sure if I'm right. It's just my gut tells me, my 33 years experience tells me, and my the reality that I'm looking at tells me that something's wrong
Yeah.
here.
Well, it's Orwellian. It's like, don't believe your own eyes, believe what the government tell you. Do you know what I mean? Like, I can see
Yeah.
my community's being flooded by, substitute prescriptions, and that has created a knock-on effect. We're seeing it in Canada. The government supplying so-called.
Yeah, in Vancouver's terrible
Yeah,
mess.
the government, they're calling it a safe supply. Even the language around it's Orwellian. How can you? There's no safe supply of opioids. Are you mental? Do you know what I mean? Like,
Yeah.
these drugs are horrendous, for the human condition. Great if you're, in pain, suffering from, an
Well, even
injury.
when we had the rehab, we would prefer people to go over to Subutex because it just seemed that when they were on the methadone, they would just seem so dumbed down. It was
I
almost
had this,
impossible.
yeah,
But when you put them on the
yeah,
Subutex, you could see that there was
yeah,
improvement and they
absolutely.
could engage and
Yeah,
develop.
I had that conversation the other day, and with those women that I was telling you about, and I says, there's no way on God's earth I can help anybody to recover whilst they're sedated. It's impossible. I
No.
cannot get anywhere near the pain that needs to come up in order for them to heal. And these women, very, I mean, they were so patronisingly told me that was nonsense. And I was like, are you,
Yeah.
okay, we're going to have to agree to disagree here. Like you said, there's a much better drugs, like Buvidal or the buprenorphines, where people are still, they're cognitively, they're here, they're with
Yeah.
us.
Well, they got some room to
Yeah,
develop
yeah.
on that.
So, yeah, obviously it's, I think in 5 years' time, we won't, I think one of the reasons why most people aren't really interested in this area unless you are in recovery or have some sort of financial motive, or is because drug addicts are still seen as moral degenerates. We're still seen as being people who have made bad choices, lifestyle choices. In fact, the head of the drug death task force in Scotland was on radio with me a couple of years ago, and that's what she said. She called it a lifestyle choice. So, there's a horrendous lack of understanding about what this condition entails and what it takes to recover from it. And I think history will judge us very, very harshly, for how we attempted to deal with it. I mean, the man on the street, the common sense, and I think most people who are in the industry have been educated out of their instincts. We know, the man on the street knows giving a drug addict more drugs is a recipe for disaster, And I'm not saying that there is no value in it initially, but to continue to meet people where they're at is important. But to leave them there and not have any expectations or hope for anything better than where they're at is unethical. It's that simple. It's
Yeah.
unethical,
It's demonic, I think. Yeah. And again, the word overdose kind of sums it up. And where's most of them drugs coming from? And I'm pretty sure it's coming from pharmaceuticals and
Well,
government agencies
you can see that in the
yeah,
toxicology reports. It's there for
yeah,
for everybody to see. Yeah.
yeah.
But yet there's
They
still
not
a
really seem to
denial
be
that
putting
that's
it
the
together.
problem.
Yeah, and I think that's the thing about addiction on all levels, even people in recovery, there certainly is a real element of denial to it all. And I think, even talking to somebody like yourself that got a really good foundation and, probably a desire to sort of learn and see what's going on for yourself and showing some interest in it, which again is why I think that, the
Well, you mentioned
faces and
earlier.
voices of recovery and you addressing that anonymity and getting people to stand up, because again I always have this dream of being able to get like 100 people in abstinence recovery and 100 people in whatever the other versions of recovery and sit them on two different sides of the room and say, look, you tell me the difference, because you'll see these brains have recovered and these ones aren't recovered.
Yeah.
And you can see the difference. It's because again, I feel that I've understood this for a lot of years. The people that come out of our rehabs, when they went back to the local authorities, I would often get phone calls of saying, "What are you doing? There's something so different about these people coming back to our services than even other rehabs, because they just want to get on. They want to. They're re-inspired, and it's like, well, because empowered a part of their brain that were denied access, and showed them how to look after that and develop that. And it was a tangible experience that other people had, but again, trying to actually get and say, look, this is achievable, but we do need these communities. And there's a lot more we could do in the community to support the growth in these minds.
And I think that's the advantage we have. We see that growth and that development. In fact, not only do we see it, we expect it. And the treatment system doesn't expect it. Do you know what I mean? And we are faced with it and nurtured in it and every day. And they don't. So when they do see it, they're like, what the hell is this? So I think, going back to the right to recovery bill, if we can give access, I think the drug legalisation lobby has been, when harm reduction was first introduced, it was never, the doctors at the time, like Strang and, various high profile people at the time who were advocating for harm reduction interventions, they were at pains to help the legislators and the policy and the government at the time see that this wasn't a slippery slope to legalisation. And I think over time what's happened is the harm reduction movement, and in fact someone who was being abusive to me the other day on Twitter claimed that he was part of the progressive harm reduction movement, and what he actually means is the legalisation lobby. But I think there's a real danger now that harm reduction, the kind of baby gets thrown out with the bathwater, because the legalisation lobby, harm reduction is becoming synonymous with legalisation. I was in a meeting the other day where the women, relatively new to the addiction field but in a very senior position in Scotland, only her organisation had only been working in the addiction field for the last 2.5 years, and she was outraged that we were not providing tourniquets and crack pipes, and if we could only do that when there would be less deaths. And I was just like, these people are mad, these people are insane, being outraged at the fact that we're not providing free tourniquets. So I think there's, very big political lobbying groups with a lot of money behind them who want to see legalisation. I think there's a whole element of public health professionals want to see legalisation as well, because what that would entail would be, the government could essentially wash their hands of providing any treatment. It's legal, you're making your own choice, it's up to you, hell slap it into you, as my mother would say. But that point you made earlier about the language being deliberately confusing, I learned to speak their language. I've been working in this field for 20 odd years now, and I had a relatively senior role in the structures of, similar to the DATs in England, so the alcohol and drug partnerships they are in Scotland. And I know how to speak the language, and I know how much denial they're in, and I know that there's an element of protectionism going on, not just in the industry. The industry's massive, as far as an employee. I'd love somebody to do a forensic analysis of how many people are employed. There seems to me, what Huey from Blackpool described it. He said in the morning in the schemes in Blackpool, you'll see a whole army of middle class professionals driving in Monday to Friday at 9 a.m. and then driving out again at 5 p.m. So seems to me that there's a real two-tier system going on here, and I dread to think how big an industry it is. I'd love to know, actually. But keeping people in poverty and keeping people in addiction.
Yeah, I mean, even though I'm a treatment professional myself, I do love the idea that I don't think professionals are going to solve this problem anyway. Mm-hmm. And I think it's really the ultimate promotion is that when I think the general public actually understand that they can actually get a lot of this for free, and that the solution is in the community.
Well, this is it.
If we put our efforts there, and we don't really need the government to solve this problem. In actual fact, they seem to be a big hindrance to it. That's been the experience of my journey so far.
Yeah, there's a lot in that, Lester, and we need to recognise that this is essentially a bigger problem. You know, why are so many young people, why are so many people in general trying to get oblivion? And why has drug use become so normalised? You know, that we're even talking about safe supply and safe consumption rooms. You know, this
hallucinogenics have been made legal in Australia and certain parts of Canada, I think, and America.
Yeah,
and
this is speaking to a much bigger problem with the spiritual nature of humanity, you know, and the lack of connection, that we are seeking connection through chemical oblivion. You know, like, I think that's a much bigger cultural discussion, and that's about, you know, the breakdown of, you know, meaning and purpose in our lives, the disconnection, you know, particularly with the internet and so many of us leading lives online.
I think you said it earlier, again, based on my own experience at being 25 years old and in a state of complete desperation. But I think the real cherry on the cake was I felt like I'd lost all hope. I tried so much, and I think when I went into my first AA meeting, I really was completely hopeless, which was a suicidal kind of situation to find myself in. And from that very first meeting, I remember praying, please God, let me be an alcoholic, because it just gave me such great hope.
Yeah.
And I think from that first meeting, I never drunk again, because I found something to give me hope. And I think the world's becoming such a, well, whatever the government, I just think it is the governments or the people that are pulling their strings, that the world's becoming such a hopeless place that then people are going to turn to drugs and
well, I read
stuff like that.
I read something Keith Humphreys said, and Keith is a Stanford professor who's, in my opinion, one of the best researchers in this field. And he said, you know, that essentially we have to be really careful that we're not just sedating poverty. And I think that's, you know, if we go back to the 1980s and all those, you know, young men who became addicted with the first waves of brown powder heroin in particular, you know, that was about unemployment. Methadone was like and Mark Gellman described it as a fire hose. You know, we went into the schemes and housing associations, just sprayed everybody down with methadone. And that was a sedation of poverty. And it's not just poverty in the material sense. And I think over the next 40 years, I think that we're going to see a recession like we've never seen before. And I think that poverty, you know, from a lack of hope point of view, I think people are going to see more despair than they've ever seen before. And that's not to say I'm, you know, a mongerer of doom here, because I think that poverty, and when it's experienced by the whole nation, could have, of course, a lot of suffering, but there's a gift of desperation that comes with extreme poverty, and not just material poverty. You know, like you described, and what I experienced was the real poverty of spirit. You know, and it's that brought me to my knees and essentially brought me into solutions. So paradoxically, that despair that I think is being fostered on the world at the moment by the political or the elite, I think that will, and over time, bring new hope as well. I think the human spirit rallies when you know, often, if you know, it can get access to people who have also been in that place of absolute despair, there will always be hope. And I think that's what you experienced at your first meeting. I probably experienced it as well. And I think real fruit can be born. Even think about it, the AA fellowship was born in the 30s. You know, it was born during the Great Recession, and I think that will happen again, and there'll be a, you know, our fellowship has steadily grown over the last 100 years, and it will continue to grow. You know, and I think it's, in times of despair, it grows faster. So, although there'll be suffering, I still have tremendous hope.
Yeah, well, there is a way out.
Yeah.
It's like that was going to be the name of the book for AA. They wanted to call it The Way Out, but I think there was 14 other books with that title already, so they called it Alcoholics Anonymous. But Bill I think after 13 years, he wished he called it Altered Attitudes, which is why I chose the name of the podcast. But the Right to Recovery Bill, I guess that's aimed at Parliament, the Scottish Parliament. How far is that's getting? What's the difficulties and that you could possibly have with that? Is that something that they're starting to listen to a little bit, or?
I couldn't possibly predict which way this will go, right? If you look at it from a votes, because you need votes to get a bill passed. The ruling party currently is the Scottish National Party, and they have the majority, and they seem hell bent on decriminalisation / legalisation. You'll have people that argue that decriminalisation doesn't mean legalisation, but it does, right? And we could get into that another time, but they're hell bent on that, and the people who are advising them, the experts, are telling them that that's the way forward. That will just have absolutely devastating consequences to especially our poorest communities, where you're currently 18 times more likely to die from a drug deaths than in our sort of ordinary communities. So all the odds are stacked against this bill, but again, the general public's behind it. So purely from a numbers game voting point of view, the odds are stacked against it. But the general public's behind it. Every church in Scotland's behind it. The poverty industry in Scotland's behind it. The homeless industry in Scotland's behind it. A lot of Civic Scotland are behind it. The press are behind it. It's been debated, and even the fact that it's been debated that this should be a law, that people should be able to access treatment. And one of the main things that's came out of the debate about this bill has been the opportunity to tell the public that when you hear the word treatment, it's a substitute prescription, it's not treatment. So when your government or when your agencies are telling you we're spending X amount on treatment, you're automatically thinking rehab, and that's not what people are getting. So the very nature of this bill coming to Parliament has been massive in raising the debate and educating people, which is one of our aims as a charity, about addiction and also about recovery. So for us, it's already been a win, in a lot of respects. But we'll see. I mean, with God, all things are possible, and I think there's a lot of support for this bill, because so many people now, it's not just, I've got to laugh, when we started talking about it, the press started talking about a cost of living crisis. It only became a crisis because the middle classes started having problems paying their bills. It's always been a crisis for, the working classes, making ends meet, and obviously. So I think what's happening now is we're seeing a tipping point with addiction as well, and that the middle classes are starting to be affected by it, and their families are starting to be affected by it, and their sons and daughters are starting to die as well. So I think once enough people are affected by it, then it'll get the serious nature. The discussion, the debate will rise enough into the seriousness of which it deserves. I think up until now we've still been able to stigmatise people and to swipe the debate away, but this bill is doing that. At the very least, if that's all it does, well, it's a win. But I think the industry across the UK, and I know from the correspondence that I get from across the world, people are watching it from all over the world, from the Western world certainly, because if it gets passed in Scotland, it has to get passed in other countries as well. The right to addiction treatment, the right to rehab, the right to Buvidal, the right to Methadone, the right to, having those rights enshrined in law is a big difference from being at the whim of whatever politicians are in place, and the variety of different countries across the world. So it's a once in a lifetime. I think it's a once in a lifetime opportunity. But if it fails, if it doesn't get through the first stage or the second stage, those 3 stages, I think it'll still be worthwhile in that I'm a big believer that I've seen loads of projects start or loads of growth and development start and maybe not take, the seed has planted, it might not bear fruit in that particular person or in that particular place at that particular time, but someone else spotted the seed, and someone else
Yeah.
planted another seed. So the unknown nature of what impact this will have will be beyond my perception and what I can evaluate or monitor, So I think we're already winning having raised the discussion about people
Yeah.
should have
Well, I
access to
think
real
like you say,
treatment.
the people in recovery are starting to rise up a little bit, and some are, with your faces of recovery, that people are starting to rally together, and I think ultimately that's going to be the change to be seen, and for people to understand that there is another way, that there is a way
Yeah.
out.
I did a
I think,
podcast with an American the other day, and he said, it looks to me like you're bang on time. He said, you did that first 10 years of being conciliatory and building relationships, building bridges from the harm reduction community into the recovery community. He said, now you're angry. You're bang on time. So I do take
yeah,
sort of solace from that, we always knew when we started that we wanted to organise and mobilise the recovery community politically. And that seems to be what we've
yeah,
done. I've never been confident or assured about my leadership, but there's no one else has came forward to do it. So I'm open to other people to helping, other ideas, other support. Somebody else wants to take on my job, I'll hand it over willingly.
the first AA group I was in Canada was called the Trailblazers, and because I lived on this island, I love reading the stories about the pioneers
Yep.
and the early pioneers that were the loggers. They used to be these little cities that would be these like really crazy guys that were so tough and rough that they would cut their way into these forests and spend years sort of on their own with their little group. But when finally civilization caught them up, because they'd become so wild, they weren't able to live in the cities that they'd. So I think the pioneers it's a tough job, but
Yeah.
like my mate said, look, if you're gonna cut a path, make it a wide one
Yeah.
so
No,
other people
absolutely.
can get through. So I really appreciate you
Well, I
talking to
think,
us today and for flying the
yeah.
flag for recovery. I think it's so important, and I think it is the right time now.
Yeah, and I think, to finish up, I just want to say that even from I was a wee child, a wee girl, where I was experiencing that violence and that harm, I knew it was unjust. There was part of my soul that was fighting. From my earliest memory, I knew it was wrong and I knew it was unjust, and I would never, there was other people obviously around me who would cower and walk away and not take on the fight. And I took it on. I took it on for a very young age. And it's through me like a stalk of rock. It's who I am. I can't not fight. And I can't not fight when I see such injustice, and I see such abuse of power, abuse of public funds, abuse of people who are suffering. And, I see myself as a completely, like just not up, like whose idea was this? Like, who put me in this position? Do you know what I mean? Like, and I certainly have led my life under the auspices of our third step. Like, just show me, I'll show up. You show me, a life of service has been, that I will do. There's a section in the big book, I think it's on page 98. I screenshotted it last night, actually. I was at a big book study group. I'll just read it out to you. I think this would be a lovely way to finish. And it says, never avoid these responsibilities, but be sure you're doing the right thing if you assume them. Helping others is the foundation stone of your recovery. A kindly act once in a while isn't good enough. You have to act the Good Samaritan every day, if need be. It may mean the loss of many nights' sleep, great interference with your pleasures, interruptions to your business. It may mean sharing your money and your home, counselling frantic wives and relatives, innumerable trips to police courts, sanitariums, hospitals, jails and asylums. Your telephone may jangle at any time of the day or night. Your wife may sometimes say she is neglected. A drunk may smash the furniture in your home or burn the mattress. You may have to fight with him if he is violent. Sometimes you will have to call a doctor and administer sedatives under his direction. Another time you may have to send for the police or an ambulance. Occasionally you will have to meet such conditions. We seldom allow an alcoholic to live in our homes for a long time, but it is not good for him and sometimes creates serious complications in a family. But what I took from that reading last night was, that's in the chapter Working with Others, page 97, is, I have had, and I continue to sponsor, I'm very lucky that I'm able to do that. I'm in a position to do that. That I don't want to be the good Samaritan, do you know what I mean? But my life depends on it, and it's became a way of life for me to show up and be a service. And that, I'm not playing the martyrdom hero story here. That is my life. That is who I am. It is through me like a stalk of rock. I was always wanting to help people from a very, very young age before I got, consumed by addiction. Even in my addiction, what little I had, I wanted to give. And I'll continue to try and help where I can.
Yeah. I think you sort of realise, and I do myself, is what we've been given is very important because of what it did for our lives and what we've been spared of. I've been spared of 33 years of probably misery if I'd have been alive still. And it is, I feel the same as you. I'm like 57 and there's part of me I just want to retire and go off. But there's a part of me that always reminds me how important that this is. And even you reading that's always been an important passage to me, because back in the early days when we started in the sober living houses in Watford, I read that and I kind of ticked off all of the boxes except the cigarette burn. And then one day I took a load of guys to a meeting in my car, and when I kind of got home at the end of the meeting and cleared the car out, there was a cigarette burn about that long. It was like they must have lit the cigarette and dropped it, and instead of being angry about it, I thought, oh good, I can tick that one off.
Brilliant. Brilliant.
I think it's so fantastic, recovery, and again, you just do want. I think there's a bit in the third edition that it says that I think it was Bill talking to Henrietta, and he was saying to her that he's so grateful what the Lord's done to him, is the words that he used in there, that he just can't keep. He just keeps wanting to tell people. And I think because it is just that fantastic. Yeah. So I'm like you. I'm hopeful for the future.
We've got the discernment and the wisdom to see that it's got worse. It's probably going to get worse, but there's always hope.
Yeah, always hope. And so, if people wanted to learn more about the bill to the right to recovery and of Voices and Faces, what would they where would they find that if they wanted to learn more or get involved?
The oracle that is Google. Just type into Google the Right to Recovery Bill or Faces and Voices of Recovery, and it's all there. In fact, if you've got ChatGPT, you could ask that as well and let me know what it says. So, and of course, you can email me at Annmarie at facesandvoicesofrecoveryuk.org. My number's online as well if anybody wants to give me a call.
Appreciate it, Annmarie. Really appreciate you coming on and sharing today. It's tons to think about. We're coming up to a couple of hours, so should probably end it there, or Matt will be worrying about what to do with it all. It's probably going to be a two-parter. But I'm sure we'll be calling on you again for some more chats. But really good to meet you, and thank you very much for coming on.
And I really appreciate the opportunity to come and talk a wee bit more about the bill, about the charity, and obviously about my own personal experience. And it's great to hear from someone else who's got that length as well, that especially working in the field and seeing the catastrophic nature of how things have developed, and to speak about that. So honestly, that's important to me as well. I think I'm on quite a journey, having a bit of a 360 or 180 on stuff. So yeah, I'd love to keep chatting more. Let's see if we can get that set up.
Anytime. Well, God bless, and I hope to
All
speak
right,
to you
bye.
soon.
God bless, Lester. Bye bye.